Sable had rehearsed this moment for 3 days. She had practiced the words in her mirror, in the bath, in the dark of her room, with her fist pressed against her mouth so no one would hear. And now, standing in the doorway of the grand hall with her travel bag slung over one shoulder and her resignation letter clutched in her trembling hand, she could not remember a single one of them. The hall was full. Of course it was full. The entire court had gathered for the betrothal announcement. Every noble house, every advisor, every perfumed lady and polished lord packed into the gilded room like sardines in silk. Flower garlands hung from the rafters. Musicians tuned their instruments in the gallery above. Servants moved through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling wine. And at the far end, standing on the raised dais beneath the Valdrin crest, was King Caspian Thorn. He looked magnificent. He always looked magnificent, and Sable hated him for it. Hated the way the ceremonial black jacket sat across his shoulders. Hated the sharp line of his jaw and the way the candlelight caught in his dark hair. Hated, most of all, the way her chest tightened every single time she looked at him. Even now. Even after everything. Beside him stood Lady Eveline Marsh. Blonde. Beautiful. Daughter of the most powerful duke in the Eastern Territories. She was laughing at something Caspian had said, her hand resting on his arm with the easy confidence of a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. Sable did not belong here. She had known that for 7 years. 7 years as the palace record keeper, buried in the archives 3 floors below the throne room, cataloging treaties and supply logs and correspondence that no one ever read. 7 years of being invisible to everyone who mattered, including the man she had been silently, stupidly, hopelessly in love with since the night he had carried her out of a burning building when she was 19 years old. He did not remember that night. She was certain of it. He had saved dozens of people during the border fires. She was just another face, another body slung over his shoulder, another life filed under duty performed. But Sable remembered. She remembered the smoke in her lungs and the heat blistering through the walls, and the moment a pair of arms had closed around her, lifting her like she weighed nothing, and a voice had said, low and steady through the roar, "I have you." She had been a fool to build a life around a single sentence spoken by a man who would never say it to her again. The resignation letter was damp in her hand. She had written it 3 times. The final version was a single line. "I hereby resign my position as royal record keeper, effective immediately." She just needed to leave this letter on her desk, walk out the servants' gate, and disappear before anyone noticed she was gone. No one would notice. That was the whole point. Sable turned away from the hall and walked toward the archive stairs. The music swelled behind her, bright and celebratory, and something inside her cracked, but she kept walking. She descended 3 flights, placed the letter in the center of her desk, and stood there for a moment, letting herself feel the full weight of what she was doing. Leaving. Not just the job, but the proximity. The stolen glimpses of him crossing the courtyard. The pathetic comfort of knowing she breathed the same air as the man who had saved her life, and never thought of her again. Her wolf whimpered inside her chest. A low, keening sound that vibrated through her bones. Sable pressed her hand over her heart and whispered, "I know." Then she picked up her bag and left. The servants' gate was unguarded. Everyone was at the celebration. The night air hit her face, cold and sharp and smelling of pine and wet earth. And for the first time in years, Sable took a full breath. She made it 14 steps before the voice stopped her. "Miss Whitmore." Sable froze. The voice belonged to Hadrian Cole, the King's Chancellor and second in command. She turned slowly and found him standing in the shadow of the gate arch, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she could not read. "Going somewhere?" he asked. Her heart hammered. "I have resigned my position," she said, lifting her chin. "I am free to leave." Hadrian studied her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "He is going to notice, you know." Sable almost laughed. "No," she said, her voice barely holding steady. "He really is not." She turned and walked into the dark. Behind her, the palace erupted in cheers as the betrothal was announced, and Sable did not look back. 3 days earlier, Sable had not been planning to leave. She had been planning to survive, the way she always did. Quietly, invisibly, one archived document at a time. The archive was her kingdom. 3 vaulted rooms connected by narrow corridors, every wall lined with shelves, every shelf packed tight with the administrative memory of the Valdrin throne. Treaties with the mountain clans, census records from the outer territories, trade agreements with the coastal ports, correspondence between kings stretching back 400 years. No one came down here unless they had to. The air was cool and faintly dusty. The light came from candles and the occasional narrow window set high in the stone walls, and the silence was so complete that Sable could hear her own heartbeat. She loved it. She loved the order of it, the way every document had a place and every place had a purpose. She loved that the work mattered even if no one acknowledged it. When the king needed to know the exact terms of the Ashbourne Treaty before a negotiation, it was Sable who found it. When the chancellor required trade volume figures for the last decade, it was Sable who compiled them. When the council argued about historical precedent, it was Sable's meticulous cross-referencing that settled the debate. She had never been thanked. Not once. The documents simply appeared on the relevant desk, and no one asked how they got there. What she had not stopped doing, despite every rational argument she made to herself, was watching the king. She watched him cross the courtyard from her window every morning at precisely the 7th bell. She watched him in council when she was called to deliver documents, always from the back of the room, always leaving before he could glance her way. She watched the way he carried tension in his jaw when negotiations went badly, and the way his hand moved through his hair when he was frustrated, and the way he smiled, rare and reluctant and devastating, when his younger sister said something that caught him off guard. All those years of watching, of learning every expression, every habit, every tell, of loving a man who had looked through her so many times she had started to wonder if she was actually invisible. And then, 3 days before the betrothal announcement, the thing happened that broke her. It was late afternoon. Sable had been summoned to the council chamber to deliver a set of historical trade records that Chancellor Hadrian had requested. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, knocked, entered, placed the documents on the table, and turned to leave. And walked directly into the king. He had been standing just inside the door, reading something, and she had not seen him because she had trained herself never to look directly at him in close quarters. The collision was not graceful. She stumbled, the remaining papers in her arms scattered across the floor, and she dropped to her knees immediately, scrambling to gather them. "I am so sorry, Your Majesty. Forgive me. I did not see you standing there." She reached for the last document at the same moment he crouched down and reached for it too. Their fingers touched. The contact was brief, barely a second, skin against skin, and it sent a jolt through her body so violent she nearly gasped. Her wolf lunged forward inside her chest, slamming against her ribs with a force that stole her breath. Sable snatched her hand back and looked up. King Caspian Thorn was looking directly at her. Not through her. At her. His gray eyes were fixed on her face with an expression she had never seen before. Something startled and searching, like he had just heard a sound he could not identify. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice. That voice. Low and quiet and so close she could feel the warmth of his breath. Sable's throat closed. "Fine," she managed. "Perfectly fine, Your Majesty. My apologies for the disruption." She stood, clutching the papers to her chest like armor, and fled the room without looking back. In the stairwell, she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and tried to breathe. Her hands were shaking. Her wolf was howling inside her, clawing and desperate, and Sable clamped down on it with every ounce of control she had. No, 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 no. She knew what that jolt meant. Every shifter knew. The recognition, the pull, the bond trying to form, reaching across the space between two people and saying, This one, this one belongs to you. But bonds were not one-sided. If she had felt it, he should have felt something too. And the look on his face, that brief flash of confusion, that searching expression, he had felt it. And he had let her walk away without a word. That night, Sable lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and let the truth settle over her like a stone. He had felt the pull. She was sure of it. And he had chosen to ignore it. Because she was nobody. A record keeper. A foundling who had grown up in the palace orphanage and worked her way into a position so invisible that she might as well have been part of the furniture. Of course he would ignore it. He was a king. He needed alliances, bloodlines, political advantage. He needed Lady Eveline Marsh and her father's armies, and her mother's connections to the Eastern courts. He did not need Sable Whitmore and her dusty archives. The betrothal had been rumored for weeks. But that evening, Corbin Hale, one of the senior guards who sometimes brought her tea when he was on archive duty, confirmed it. "It is official," he told her, setting the cup on her desk. "The announcement is in 3 days. The whole court is invited." Sable wrapped her hands around the warm cup and smiled. "How lovely," she said. And something inside her, something that had held on all this time through sheer stubborn refusal to let go, finally snapped. She began writing her resignation letter that night. The road north from the capital wound through dense forest for the first 2 days, then opened into rolling farmland dotted with stone-walled villages. Sable had planned her route carefully. The town of Brannock, 3 days' ride from the palace, had a small apothecary that was looking for an assistant. She had written ahead, using her mother's surname, and received a polite reply offering her a trial position. It was not glamorous. It was not even interesting. But it was far enough away that she would never accidentally see the king crossing a courtyard, and that was all she needed. The first day of travel was easy. Adrenaline carried her through it. The fierce, giddy energy of having finally done the thing she should have done years ago. She rode hard, ate little, and slept beneath the stars with her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders. The second day was harder. The adrenaline faded, and what replaced it was a hollow, aching emptiness in her chest that grew worse with every mile she put between herself and the palace. Her wolf, which had been agitated since the moment she walked through the servants' gate, had gone eerily quiet. Not calm, not settled. Silent in the way an animal goes silent when it is in pain. By the third morning, Sable could barely stand. The emptiness had become a physical weight, pressing down on her lungs, making it hard to breathe. Her hands trembled when she tried to saddle her horse. Her vision blurred at the edges, and she had to stop twice on the road to lean against a tree and wait for the dizziness to pass. She made it to Brannock by late afternoon, pale and shaking, and presented herself at the apothecary with a smile that felt like it might crack her face in half. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the world had continued without Sable Whitmore, as she had always known it would, for exactly 9 hours. Chancellor Hadrian Cole discovered her resignation letter when he went to the archives to retrieve a treaty amendment. The archives were locked. He fetched a spare key, opened the door, and found the single sheet of paper in the center of the desk. He spent the next hour attempting to locate the documents he needed on his own. He could not find them. The archive's organizational system, which Sable had built and maintained entirely by herself, was logical and precise, but only if you understood it. Without her, the shelves were an impenetrable maze of leather and parchment. By the afternoon session, the council was in disarray. Documents were unfindable. The quartermaster needed historical grain yields from a section of the archive none of the clerks had ever entered. "Where is the record keeper?" one of the advisors finally asked. "Gone," Hadrian replied. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "Gone where?" asked Lord Pemberton, the eldest counselor. "I do not know," Hadrian said. "She resigned." The council exchanged glances. Half of them had never spoken to Sable, but every single one of them had at some point received precisely the document they needed at precisely the moment they needed it, delivered silently and without fanfare to their desks. The king, who had been reading a report at the head of the table, looked up. "Who resigned?" he asked. "Miss Whitmore," Hadrian said. "The royal record keeper." Caspian frowned. The frown deepened, and something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of something Hadrian could not identify. "When?" Caspian asked. 3 days ago," Hadrian replied. "The night of the betrothal announcement." Caspian went still. His pen stopped moving. His gaze fixed on a point in the middle distance, and for a moment he seemed to be somewhere else entirely, reaching for a memory he could not quite grasp. "The woman from the corridor," Caspian said slowly. "Dark hair, brown dress." Hadrian felt a cold prickle move down his spine. "You remember her?" "She walked into me," Caspian said. His frown deepened further, his hand moving unconsciously to his chest. 3 days ago. She dropped her papers. That was not how Hadrian had expected this conversation to go. "Did she say anything about leaving?" Caspian asked. "No," Hadrian replied carefully. "She said nothing to anyone." Caspian was quiet for a long moment. His hand was still pressed against his chest, his fingers spread wide over his sternum, and he seemed completely unaware he was doing it. "Find her," he said. The words came out quiet and strange, weighted with an urgency that did not match the situation. A record keeper had resigned. That was an administrative inconvenience, not a crisis. But the king's voice carried something else beneath the words, something raw that made Hadrian straighten in his seat. "Your Majesty, she is well within her rights to resign," Hadrian said. "I am aware of that." Caspian's jaw tightened. "Find her anyway." Hadrian studied his king for a long moment. "May I ask why?" Caspian did not answer immediately. His hand pressed harder against his chest, and Hadrian saw something he had never seen on the Alpha King's face. Confusion. Genuine, unsettled confusion. "Because something is wrong," Caspian said at last, "and I do not know what it is. But it started 3 days ago, and it is getting worse." Hadrian found Sable in 6 days. He arrived in Brannock on a gray morning and found her behind the apothecary counter, sorting dried herbs into glass jars. She looked terrible. Her face was drawn, her cheeks hollow, dark shadows bruised beneath her eyes. The bell above the door chimed. Sable looked up, and the color drained from her face. "Chancellor," she said. "Miss Whitmore?" Hadrian said pleasantly. "You are a remarkably difficult woman to find." They sat in the tiny back room. Sable folded her hands in her lap and waited. Hadrian studied her. "You look unwell," he said. "I am adjusting," Sable replied. "To what?" She did not answer that. "Why are you here, Chancellor?" Hadrian leaned back, choosing his words carefully. "The archives are in chaos. No one can find anything. The council has been functionally paralyzed for the better part of a week." Sable blinked. She had expected many things. Anger, perhaps. A demand that she return. Maybe even a legal threat about abandoning her post without proper notice. But this, a confession of institutional helplessness, she had not anticipated. "I left detailed organizational notes in the top drawer of my desk," she said. "We found them," Hadrian replied. "They are 47 pages long and reference a color-coded indexing system that you apparently invented yourself. No one can follow them." Despite everything, something warm flickered in Sable's chest. She squashed it immediately. "I am sorry for the inconvenience," she said, "but I have resigned. I have a new position here. I am not coming back." Hadrian was quiet for a moment. "Miss Whitmore, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Sable's pulse quickened. "All right. Have you been experiencing physical symptoms since you left the palace? Fatigue? Dizziness? Chest pain? Difficulty breathing?" The question hit her like a fist. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "How did you know?" she whispered. "Because the king is experiencing the same thing," Hadrian said. The room went very still. Sable could hear the cat purring in the shop. She could hear her own heartbeat, fast and uneven. "That is not possible," she said. 3 days after your departure, the king collapsed during a training session. 2 days after that, he began experiencing insomnia, accompanied by a sensation he described as a pulling in his chest, like something has been torn out, and he cannot find where it went. Sable pressed her hand against her own chest, where the identical sensation had been slowly eating her alive for 6 days. The physician believes an incomplete bond has formed between the king and another shifter. A bond initiated through physical contact and never completed. The separation is causing both parties to deteriorate. He told me, "Find whoever left, or the king will not survive the month." Sable's breath stopped. "He is betrothed," she said, her voice cracking. "What do you expect me to do?" "I expect you to come back and let us figure this out before someone dies," Hadrian said quietly. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Sable stared at the wall behind him, at a crack in the plaster that branched like a river delta, and tried to think clearly through the fog of exhaustion and heartbreak, and the relentless, crushing pull in her chest that pointed south. Always south, back toward the palace, back toward him. "If I come back," she said slowly, "I have conditions." Hadrian raised an eyebrow. "You are in no position to negotiate." "I am in every position to negotiate," Sable replied, and something sharp and fierce crept into her voice. "You just told me the king will die without me. That makes me the most important person in this kingdom right now, even if no one knows my name." Hadrian stared at her. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. "Go on," he said. "He does not learn my name. He does not learn about the bond. Not yet." She held up her hand when Hadrian opened his mouth. "I will come back. I will be close enough to keep us both alive, but I will not be dragged in front of a betrothed king and told to fix a bond he does not want, with a woman he has never seen." Hadrian considered this. "That will be difficult to arrange. You are the chancellor. Arrange it." Another long pause. Then Hadrian stood. "Pack your things, Miss Whitmore," he said. "We leave at dawn." After he left, Sable sat alone in the back room of the apothecary and pressed both hands against her chest, where the pulling sensation had already begun to ease, just slightly, just enough to notice, as if some part of her already knew she was going home. Her wolf stirred after days of silence, a low, aching sound that was not quite grief and not quite hope, but something fragile and terrified caught between the two. "I know," Sable whispered. "I know." She began to pack. Hadrian's solution was elegant and infuriating. He installed Sable in a chamber on the servants' level directly beneath the king's quarters, told the household staff she was a visiting archivist on temporary assignment, and gave her a schedule designed to maximize proximity without direct contact. She would work in the small reading room adjacent to the council chamber during morning sessions. She would take her meals in the kitchens during the same hour the king dined in the hall above. She would walk the inner courtyard at dusk, when Caspian took his evening rounds along the upper terrace. Always close, never seen. It was, Sable thought as she unpacked her single bag in the narrow room that smelled of whitewash and old wood, the most elaborate game of hide-and-seek in the history of the Valdrin court. But it worked. Within hours of returning to the palace, the crushing weight in her chest began to lift. By the next morning, she could breathe without pain. By the second day, the trembling in her hands had stopped, and the color had returned to her face. Hadrian checked on her that evening, standing in her doorway with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. "Better?" he asked. "Better," Sable admitted. "Good. The king's symptoms have also improved. He slept 4 hours last night. That is the most he has managed in 9 days." Hadrian paused. He does not know why. Sable turned back to the stack of documents she had been organizing. She had agreed to resume her archival work as part of the arrangement, and she had been genuinely appalled by the state of the records after just 10 days without her. "Someone filed the Ashbourne Treaty under agricultural imports," she said. "Under the letter A, because Ashbourne starts with A." Hadrian winced. That would be Lord Pemberton's clerk. It took all of Sable's willpower not to scream. The first week passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. She worked from the reading room, a small space separated from the main council chamber by a single oak door that was always closed. She could hear him through it. His voice carried, low and commanding, issuing orders, asking questions, occasionally disagreeing with an advisor in a tone that made her skin prickle. She pressed her palm flat against the door once, just once, and felt the vibration of his voice through the wood, and her wolf surged so hard she had to sit down. "Stop it," she told herself. "This is proximity, not intimacy. You are a medicine, not a person to him. He does not even know you are here." But the bond did not care about her logic. She felt him everywhere, felt the precise moment he entered the building each morning, a warmth blooming behind her sternum like a second heartbeat. Felt the moment he left at night, a cooling absence that made her pull her blankets tighter. On the fourth day, she made a mistake. She had been in the reading room, deeply absorbed in cross-referencing a set of territorial maps, when the oak door opened without warning. Sable looked up and froze. Caspian stood in the doorway. He had been mid-conversation with someone behind him. His head turned, his hand on the doorframe, but the moment he stepped through, he stopped. His entire body went rigid. His head snapped toward her with the sharp, instinctive focus of a predator catching a scent. Their eyes met. The bond detonated. There was no other word for it. A wall of heat slammed through Sable's body, stealing her breath, flooding her veins with liquid fire. Her wolf howled, throwing itself against her ribs with desperate, frantic force. The room seemed to tilt, the air between them thickening into something she could almost see, a shimmering tension that connected his chest to hers like a thread pulled taut. Caspian's hand dropped from the doorframe. His pupils were blown wide, his lips parted, and he stared at her with an expression of such raw, unguarded shock that Sable felt it in her bones. "You," he said. The word was barely a whisper, but it landed like a thunderclap. Behind him, an advisor appeared. "Your Majesty? Is something the matter?" Caspian did not blink. "Continue without me," he said, his voice steady despite the rapid pulse hammering in his throat. "I need a moment." The advisor retreated. The door swung shut. And then it was just the two of them, standing 5 feet apart in a room full of old maps and older silence. "You were in the corridor," Caspian said slowly. "Weeks ago. You dropped papers." "Yes," Sable managed. His eyes swept over her face, searching, cataloging, and she could feel the bond straining between them, pulling, demanding, growing louder with every second of eye contact. "Who are you?" he asked. The question was quiet but urgent, weighted with something far beyond casual curiosity. "No one," Sable said. "I am the archivist." He took a step toward her. Sable's heart slammed against her ribs. "What is your name?" he asked. "I am just the archivist, Your Majesty," Sable repeated, her voice trembling. He took another step. He was close enough now that she could smell him. Cedar and iron and something warm underneath that made her wolf keen with longing. His hand came up slowly, hovering near her jaw without touching, and she could see his fingers shaking. "Something is happening," he said, his voice rough and low. "I can feel it. Can you feel it?" Sable's eyes burned. Every fiber of her body was screaming at her to close the distance, to press her face into his chest, to let the bond have what it wanted. Instead, she stepped back. "I should go," she said. She watched the confusion and hurt flash across his face before he could suppress it. He let his hand drop. "Wait," he said, but she was already moving, grabbing her papers, slipping past him without contact, pulling the door open and escaping into the corridor beyond. She heard him say it again behind her. "Wait," quieter this time, and the sound of it nearly broke her stride. She did not stop. In her room that night, Sable sat on the edge of her bed and shook. The bond was a living thing now, a fire behind her ribs that burned brighter every time she closed her eyes. She could feel him above her, pacing in his chambers, restless and awake, and she pressed her fists against her sternum and tried to hold herself together. "You are betrothed," she whispered into the dark. "You belong to someone else. I am no one. I am nothing." Her wolf snarled in disagreement so loudly that Sable flinched. 3 days passed. 3 days of Sable restructuring her entire schedule to avoid the king, and 3 days of the king apparently restructuring his entire schedule to find her. He appeared in the reading room unannounced. Twice. The first time, Sable was not there because she had heard his footsteps in the corridor and fled through the service entrance with an armful of census records and a dignity she would never recover. The second time, he arrived before she could escape, and she spent 45 agonizing minutes pretending to organize a shelf while he sat at the reading table and pretended to review a report. Neither of them pretended well. The silence between them was deafening, charged with the constant hum of the bond that neither acknowledged. Sable could feel his gaze on the back of her neck like a physical touch. She dropped 3 books. He cleared his throat 11 times. When she finally excused herself, her voice came out an octave higher than normal, and she walked into the doorframe on her way out. "Are you all right?" he called after her. "Perfectly fine," she said from the corridor, rubbing her shoulder and dying inside. Hadrian cornered her the next morning in the archives. "This is not working," he said bluntly. "I am aware," Sable replied through gritted teeth. "He is asking about you. Every day. Multiple times. He has taken to calling you the archivist, which he pronounces with a degree of reverence usually reserved for religious figures. Yesterday he asked me what you like to eat." Sable stared at him. "Why?" "I do not know." Hadrian rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Perhaps he intends to feed you. The point is that your anonymity has a shelf life, and it is expiring rapidly." "Then what do you suggest?" Sable asked. The royal physician recommended daily sessions. Structured proximity. Same room, same air, for extended periods. Sable let out a strangled laugh. "Clinical. You want me to sit in a room with the king for hours every day and call it clinical." "I want you both alive," Hadrian said gently. Sable pressed her hands over her face. "So if he gets worse, the betrothal falls apart. And if I help him get better, the betrothal succeeds, and he marries her." Hadrian said nothing. He did not need to. "I will do it," she said. "The daily sessions. And tell him my name. He will find out eventually, and I would rather it came from you than from him cornering me in the reading room again. He is not subtle." That evening, Hadrian arranged for them to share the small library on the second floor. Sable arrived first and positioned herself in the chair farthest from the door. When Caspian entered, the bond flared so sharply she bit the inside of her cheek. "Sable Whitmore," he said, her name in his mouth. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, and it had never sounded like that, never carried that particular weight of discovery and wonder. "Your Majesty?" she managed. He crossed to the chair opposite hers and sat. The firelight caught the angles of his face, and she watched him study her with the same intensity she had spent years directing at him. "You are the one who kept the archives," he said, "for 7 years." "Yes." "Why did you leave?" he asked. The question was soft, but it landed heavily. Sable looked down at her documents. "I had my reasons. Hadrian says you left the night of the betrothal announcement." "Yes." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. The position brought him closer, close enough that she could smell cedar and iron again, and her wolf pressed forward so hard against her chest she was sure he could see it. "Was it because of me?" he asked. The directness of it stole her breath. She looked up and found his gray eyes fixed on her face, and in them she saw something she had never expected to see there. Fear. The Alpha King was afraid of her answer. No, she lied. It was time for a change. He held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he nodded slowly, and she watched him choose to accept the lie even though they both knew what it was. They sat in silence after that. Sable pretended to read. Caspian stared into the fire. The bond hummed between them, warm and steady, and the pressure in her chest eased degree by degree until she could breathe without thinking about it. 20 minutes passed, then 30. She glanced up and found his eyes closed, his head tipped back against the chair, his breathing gone slow and deep. He was asleep. Sable stared at him, at the way the firelight softened the hard planes of his face, at the dark lashes fanned against his cheeks, at the way his hands had unclenched and lay open and relaxed in his lap. She pressed her fingers to her mouth and fought the burning in her eyes. "You beautiful, stupid, oblivious man," she thought. "I loved you before you knew my name, and you are going to marry someone else, and I am going to let you, because that is what you need, and I have spent my entire life giving people what they need and pretending I do not need anything myself." In the firelight, Caspian Thorne slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, and Sable Whitmore watched over him and said nothing at all. The sessions became routine. Every evening, same library, same chairs. He always fell asleep within the first hour, his body surrendering to rest the moment it registered her presence, a reflex he could not control and did not try to hide. Sable did not sleep. She worked and she watched him, and she memorized every detail she had been too far away to see before. The thin scar along his left eyebrow, the silver threads just beginning at his temples, markers of a burden carried too long. Slowly, the silence between them filled with something warmer. She told him about the palace orphanage, about Mistress Brennan, the elderly librarian who had taught her to find order in chaos. She did not tell him about the fire. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "You alphabetized the spice inventory," he said one evening, looking up from a report. Sable glanced at him. "How do you know about that?" "The cook came to me personally to complain. She said, and I quote, 'Some lunatic has reorganized my entire kitchen and now I cannot find the cinnamon.'" "It is under C," Sable said. "Where it belongs." She had it filed under sweet and warm, apparently. That is not a filing system. That is chaos. He laughed. It was quiet, barely more than a breath, but it transformed his entire face. The hard lines dissolved, his eyes creased at the corners. And Sable's heart did something it had no business doing. "You organize everything, don't you?" he asked, studying her with open curiosity. "Not everything," Sable said, "just the things that need it." "And what does not need it?" She considered this. "Feelings," she said. "Feelings resist organization entirely. They simply pile up in no particular order and refuse to be catalogued. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze still on her face. Then he said, very softly, "I think I know what you mean." The air between them shifted. Sable looked away first. It was 3 weeks in when it happened. Caspian was asleep, and the fire had burned low. His breathing changed, his jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. A sound escaped his throat, low and pained. Sable knelt beside his chair and reached for his hand. The moment her fingers closed around his, the world disappeared. She was standing in darkness. The air was cold and tasted of iron. Caspian stood ahead of her, and around him, consuming him, was fire. Not real fire, memory fire. The flames moved wrong, flickering in slow motion, and within the flames, shapes, faces, voices calling out. Sable's breath caught. She knew this fire. She recognized it in her bones, in the old scar tissue along her left shoulder blade that ached when the weather turned cold. The border fires. But she was seeing them differently now. Not from inside a burning building, not from the perspective of a terrified girl choking on smoke. She was seeing them from outside, from the eyes of the man who had arrived too late to stop it and too early to avoid the cost. The wreckage of homes, families who had not made it out, lives lost in the night. And Caspian walking among the ruins in the morning light, his face empty, his hands steady, while something inside him shattered beyond repair. This was his nightmare, the accumulated weight of every life he had failed to save during the border wars. Sable felt his guilt through the bond like a blade between her ribs, and then she saw herself, a girl, 19 years old, unconscious in a burning building, and Caspian, younger then, his face streaked with ash, lifting her from the wreckage and carrying her into the night. The memory played in sharp, vivid detail, his arms around her, her head against his chest, and the terrible knowledge in his eyes that she was only one, and there were hundreds he had not reached. "You remember?" Sable whispered, and the realization hit her so hard she staggered. He had always remembered. Not her name, not her face, but the weight of her in his arms, the guilt of her survival measured against all those he had lost. She stepped in front of him and placed both hands on his face. "Look at me," she demanded. "I am here. I am alive. You carried me out of that fire and I survived, and I am standing in front of you right now. That is real. That matters." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then his eyes focused, found hers, and the fire began to dim. Sable woke gasping, her hand still gripping his, her heart slamming against her ribs. She was on her knees beside his chair in the library, and Caspian was awake, staring at her with an expression of such devastating vulnerability that she could not breathe. "You were there," he said hoarsely. "Yes," Sable whispered. "In the fire. Years ago. I carried you out." "Yes." The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to press down on the walls of the room. The fire had gone to embers. The shadows had grown long. "You knew," he said. "You knew this entire time." Sable could not speak past the lump in her throat. His hand tightened around hers. "Why did you never say anything?" "Because it did not matter," she said, and her voice broke on the last word in a way that made it clear it had mattered more than anything. Caspian stared at her. His thumb moved across her knuckles, a slow, unconscious stroke that sent sparks racing up her arm. "It matters," he said quietly. "You matter." The words landed in the center of her chest and detonated, cracking open something she had kept sealed for years. Sable pressed her lips together so hard they ached. She pulled her hand free and stood on shaking legs. "I need to go," she whispered. "Sable," he started. It was the first time he had used her name without her title, just her name, raw and unadorned, and it sounded like a prayer. She fled. In the corridor, she pressed her back against the cold stone and slid to the floor and cried. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had perfected over the years, but the ugly, heaving, devastating kind that came from a place so deep she had forgotten it existed. He remembered her. He had always remembered, and now he had said her name like it meant something, and she did not know how to survive it. Because tomorrow morning, Lady Eveline Marsh would arrive at the palace to begin formal courtship, and Sable would be expected to catalog the betrothal gifts and organize the wedding preparations and watch from 3 floors below as the man she loved promised himself to someone else. Her wolf howled in her chest, furious and grieving, and Sable pressed her fist against her mouth to muffle the sound. Lady Eveline Marsh arrived with an entourage of 40, 6 carriages loaded with trunks and gifts, and an entire wing's worth of servants dressed in the blue and silver of House Marsh. The courtyard filled with noise and color and the sharp, competitive energy of a political alliance being performed for an audience. Sable watched from the archive window. 3 floors down, through a pane of glass that needed cleaning, she had a perfect view of the moment Eveline descended from her carriage and extended her hand to the king. Caspian took it. Of course he took it. He was gracious and formal and everything a king should be, and Sable watched his mouth move in greeting and felt the bond pulse with something that was not quite pain and not quite rage but lived somewhere between the two. She turned away from the window. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The betrothal gifts needed cataloging. Sable handled it because no one else could, recording each item with the same methodical precision she applied to 400-year-old treaties. Bolts of Eastern silk, a matched set of thoroughbred horses, a jeweled dagger with the Marsh crest on the hilt, a painting of the Duke's ancestral estate, rendered in oils by a court artist whose signature alone was worth more than Sable would earn in a decade. She wrote each entry in neat, steady handwriting, and if her pen pressed harder than necessary on certain words, no one was there to notice. The days that followed were a particular kind of torture. The evening sessions in the library stopped. Hadrian informed her, apologetically, that the king's schedule now required him to spend his evenings with Lady Eveline. Dinners, garden walks, performances in the Great Hall, the rituals of courtship, observed by the entire court. Sable nodded and said she understood. She did understand. That was the worst part. Without the sessions, the bond began to fray. Not break, not yet, but stretch. The warmth behind her sternum cooled to an ache. The ache deepened to a hollow. Her sleep, which had been restless but manageable, deteriorated into a cycle of waking every hour with her hand pressed against her sternum, reaching for a heartbeat that was not there. She worked longer hours. She reorganized sections of the archive that did not need reorganizing. She created a new cross-referencing index for the agricultural records and a comprehensive bibliography of every Ashbourne Treaty amendment dating back to the founding of the realm. Hadrian found her at 3 a.m, surrounded by open ledgers, her candle burned nearly to nothing. "This cannot continue," he said from the doorway. "The agricultural index is almost complete," Sable replied without looking up. "I am not talking about the index." He stepped inside and closed the door. "The king is not sleeping again. His symptoms are returning. The physician says the bond is destabilizing." Sable's pen stopped. "Then he should spend his evenings with me instead of Lady Eveline. You know that is not politically viable." "Then I do not know what you want me to tell you, Chancellor." Hadrian sat down across from her. He looked tired, genuinely tired, in a way she had never seen from him before. "The physician has proposed something," he said. "He believes a single sustained contact, skin to skin, could stabilize the bond for a longer period. Enough to buy time while we find a permanent solution." Sable stared at him. "You want me to touch him?" "Briefly, under controlled circumstances." Does the king know about this proposal? Hadrian hesitated. The king has been told that his condition requires a specific form of treatment. He has not been told it involves you specifically. Because he would refuse? Sable said. Because he would have questions, Hadrian corrected, that I am not prepared to answer while Lady Eveline's father has 40 armed men camped in our guest quarters. The gravity of that statement settled over Sable like cold water. This was not just a bond. It was a political crisis. If Duke Marsh learned that his daughter's betrothed had formed a mate bond with a nameless orphan archivist, the alliance would collapse. And without the Marsh armies backing the throne, the eastern border disputes that had been simmering for years could erupt into open conflict. She was not just inconvenient. She was dangerous. I will do it, Sable said quietly, whatever the physician recommends. But that night, lying in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling she had memorized in every crack and shadow, Sable made a different decision. She had spent her entire life being useful, being necessary, being the invisible mechanism that kept things running while everyone else took the credit. And she had accepted it, had built her identity around it, because being useful meant being allowed to stay. But this was different. This was not filing treaties or organizing ledgers. This was her heart, her bond, her mate. And she was being asked to stabilize him just enough to survive his marriage to another woman. The realization settled over her with devastating clarity. She could not do this. She could not hold his hand in a physician's office and then watch him hold Eveline's at the altar. She could not be his medicine and never his choice. She sat up in the dark. Her wolf was silent, waiting, watching her with ancient, knowing eyes. I am done being useful, Sable whispered. I am done being invisible. If he wants me, he has to choose me, and if he does not, then I leave for real this time. She would go to him, not as a treatment, not as a nameless cure arranged by his chancellor. She would go to him as herself, as Sable Whitmore, the woman who had loved him for 7 years in silence, and she would tell him the truth. All of it. And whatever happened after that would be his decision, not hers. She dressed in the dark, her hands steady, steadier than they had been in weeks. She did not take the servants' corridors. She walked through the main hall, up the central staircase, past the guards who stared at her but did not stop her because something in her expression made it clear that stopping her would be a mistake. She reached his door and knocked. Once. Hard. The door opened. Caspian stood on the other side, and the sight of him nearly undid her resolve. He looked terrible. The shadows beneath his eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and he wore no jacket, just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and the collar undone. He looked like a man being consumed from the inside out. When he saw her, his expression cracked open. Sable, he breathed. The bond roared to life between them, heat flooding through her, her wolf surging forward with a sound that was half sob and half triumph. She could feel his heartbeat in her own ribcage, fast and desperate and reaching for her. I need to tell you something, she said. He stepped aside. She walked past him into his chambers and turned to face him. 7 years ago, she began, you carried me out of a burning building during the border fires. I was 19. I know now that you remember the night, because I have been inside your nightmares, and I have seen what it costs you. Caspian went still. She pressed on. I came to work in the palace archives because it was the only position available to an orphan with no family name. But I stayed because of you. I stayed because every morning I could watch you cross the courtyard, and every time I delivered documents to the council, I could hear your voice. And that was enough. For 7 years, that was enough. Her voice wavered, but she did not stop. I left because you became betrothed to another woman, and I could not bear to watch it. And then your chancellor found me and told me you were dying because of a bond that had formed between us. A bond I had felt the moment our hands touched in that corridor. A bond you felt too. And I came back. Not because I was asked to, but because I would rather die near you than live without you. The silence that followed was absolute. Caspian stared at her. His chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths. His hands hung at his sides, and she could see the fine tremor running through them. You have been here, he said slowly, this entire time. The sessions, the library, the archivist who made me sleep. That was you. That was always you. Yes. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were bright with something she could not name. You love me, he said. It was not a question. I have loved you since I was 19 years old, Sable said, and I am tired of pretending I do not. He crossed the room in 3 strides. His hands came up to frame her face, and the contact was electric, the bond surging between them with a force that made them both gasp. She felt his emotions pour through the connection, not carefully measured, not controlled, but raw and overwhelming. Anguish, wonder, a fury directed entirely at himself for every day he had looked through her and not seen what was standing right in front of him. I felt it, he said, his voice breaking, in the corridor, when our hands touched. I felt it, and I did not understand. And then you were gone, and I could not breathe, and I could not sleep, and I thought I was losing my mind. His forehead dropped against hers. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, and his breath shook against her lips. I should have looked for you sooner. I should have known your name. I should have seen you. You are seeing me now, Sable whispered. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was 7 years of silence and distance and denial collapsing into a single point of contact, his mouth on hers, desperate and searching and achingly tender all at once. Sable's hands fisted in his shirt and pulled him closer, and the bond between them blazed. She felt it complete. All at once, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting 7 years for exactly this moment. The warmth flooded through her, golden and fierce and permanent. Caspian pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were wet. The betrothal, she started. Is over, he said. It has been over since the moment I learned your name. I will not marry a woman I do not love while my mate stands 3 floors below me and pretends she does not exist. Your mate, Sable repeated, the word cracking something open inside her that she had kept locked away her entire life. My mate, he confirmed. His voice was rough and certain and left no room for argument. Mine, if you will have me. She kissed him in answer, pulled him down to her, and poured every silent year, every stolen glance, every lonely night into the press of her mouth against his. The bond hummed between them, complete and unshakable, and for the first time in her life, Sable Whitmore felt seen. Later, they sat together on the edge of his bed, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her waist. The room was quiet except for the steady drum of his heartbeat against her ear. He was asleep, truly, deeply asleep. No nightmares, no fire, just peace. Then his breathing changed. The room dimmed. The bond pulled her under. She was standing in the fire again, but this time the flames were alive, circling Caspian, and at their center stood a figure she had never seen before. A woman, old, bent, her face a ruin of scars and fury. The old witch from the border wars, the mother of the raiding clan's chieftain. A curse laid in hatred and fire, designed to trap the king in his own guilt forever. You think love can save him? The witch said. Love is just another chain. The flames surged toward Sable, and for a moment she was 19 again, choking and helpless. But she was not 19 anymore. She was not helpless. And she was not alone. "You are feeding on his guilt," she said, her voice steady. "But guilt requires belief. And he does not have to believe you anymore." Sable knelt in front of him and took his face in her hands. "Listen to me," she said. "You did terrible things because you had to. You lost people you could not save. That is the truth, and it will always hurt. And I am not going to tell you it should not. But this," she gestured at the flames, at the witch, at the endless burning. "This is not penance. This is a prison. And you have served your sentence 1,000 times over." His eyes lifted to hers, gray and bright with unshed tears. "I was left on the steps of the palace as an infant," Sable continued, her own eyes filling. "And I spent my whole life believing that if I could just be useful enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, then maybe I would deserve to stay. Maybe someone would want me." She swallowed. "I was wrong. I was worth wanting the whole time. And so are you." The fire flickered. "Let it go," Sable whispered. "Not the grief. You are allowed to grieve, but let go of the belief that you deserve to burn for it." Caspian's hands came up to cover hers. His fingers trembled. His jaw worked. And then slowly, painfully, he exhaled. The flames died. The witch screamed and dissolved into smoke and silence. Caspian collapsed forward into Sable's arms, shaking, weeping, finally breaking open after years of holding himself together. "I have you," Sable whispered against his hair, and the words were an echo and a promise, and a beginning. "I have you." They woke side by side, in the soft gray light of dawn, foreheads touching, hands intertwined, the bond humming warm and steady between them. Caspian opened his eyes and looked at her, and for the first time, there were no shadows in his gaze. "Stay," he said. Sable smiled. "Where else would I go?" The Duke of Marsh was furious. That was expected. Hadrian managed him with the particular brand of calm, implacable diplomacy that had served 3 kings, and within a month, a new trade agreement had replaced the betrothal, one that gave House Marsh exclusive access to the northern timber routes and cost Caspian absolutely nothing he was not willing to lose. Lady Eveline, to everyone's surprise, took it rather well. She cornered Sable in the corridor 2 days after the announcement and studied her with sharp, assessing eyes. "You are the one," she said. It was not a question. Sable braced herself for hostility. "I am sorry," she began. "Do not be," Eveline interrupted. "I spent 3 weeks trying to make that man laugh and never managed it once. If you can do what I could not, then you are exactly where you should be." She extended her hand. Sable took it, startled and grateful, and felt a knot she had not known she was carrying loosen in her chest. The court's reaction was more complicated. An orphan archivist as the Alpha King's mate was not what anyone had envisioned, and the whispers followed Sable through every corridor and every hall. She heard them, felt the weight of every sidelong glance and muffled comment, and some days it was harder than others. But Caspian never wavered. He introduced her to the court with her hand in his, and his voice carrying the quiet, absolute certainty that she had learned to recognize as his way of saying, "This is not a discussion." She kept the archives. Hadrian had offered her a title, rooms on the noble floor, a wardrobe befitting a queen. Sable had accepted the rooms because sleeping next to Caspian was no longer optional for either of them, and declined everything else. "I will take a title when I have earned it," she told him, "and I will wear what I like." Hadrian had looked at Caspian. Caspian had shrugged with the expression of a man who had learned, very quickly, that arguing with Sable Whitmore was a losing proposition. The nightmares did not vanish overnight. Some nights, Caspian still woke with his heart pounding and his hands clenched, the smell of smoke lingering in his lungs. On those nights, Sable pulled him close and held him and talked about nothing, about the apprentice clerk who had misfiled an entire century of tax records, about the cat in the Brannock apothecary who had probably not even noticed she was gone, about the cook who still had not forgiven her for alphabetizing the spice rack. He laughed sometimes, quiet, exhausted, genuine laughter that vibrated against her collarbone and made her wolf purr with satisfaction. Healing was not a single moment. It was a slow, uneven, sometimes painful accumulation of better days. But the better days came more frequently now, and the fire in his dreams grew dimmer each time, and Sable was always, always there when he opened his eyes. Months later, on a morning so ordinary it felt almost defiant in its simplicity, Sable woke to pale sunlight and the steady rhythm of Caspian's breathing beside her. His arm was draped across her waist. His face was peaceful, the hard lines softened by sleep, and there were no shadows beneath his eyes. She studied him for a moment. This man she had loved in silence for 7 years, and marveled at the strange, winding, improbable path that had brought them here. She had walked away, and he had come undone. And somehow, impossibly, that had been the beginning. Sable pressed a kiss to his shoulder and settled back against his chest. His arm tightened around her in his sleep, a reflex now, instinctive and sure, and she smiled into the warmth of him. Outside the window, the courtyard was waking. Voices drifted up from the kitchens. A bird sang from the top of the oak tree she used to watch from 3 floors below. The world turned, ordinary and miraculous, and Sable closed her eyes and let herself rest. She was not invisible anymore. She never would be again. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next one.